On the morning of February 24th, 2023, a 22-year-old au pair called 911 from a home in Herndon, Virginia, screaming that an intruder had broken in and attacked her employer's wife. But when police arrived at the affluent Fairfax County residence, they found two bodies in the master bedroom and a 4-year-old girl sitting alone in the basement watching an iPad. And what investigators would uncover over the next 8 months would reveal one of the most calculated murder plots in Virginia's history. Brendan Banfield was 37 years old, and she was the kind of nurse that other nurses looked up to. She worked the pediatric intensive care unit at Innova Fairfax Medical Campus, spending her shifts caring for critically ill children, and her colleagues would later describe her as a fierce patient advocate, someone who mentored younger nurses and who would stay past the end of her shift if a child's family needed someone to hold their hand. She had also trained as a sexual assault nurse examiner, the kind of work that most people cannot stomach. But Christine believed that every victim deserved someone steady in the room. She lived in Herndon, a quiet, tree-lined suburb about 30 miles west of Washington, D.C., with her husband Brendan, a 40-year-old special agent for the Internal Revenue Service, and their 4-year-old daughter. And so from the outside, the Banfields looked like the kind of family you'd see at a neighborhood block party. The government employee and the ICU nurse with their little girl, a nice house and a good school district, everything where it should be. But behind closed doors, their 19-year relationship had been rocky. Both Brendan and Christine had histories of affairs, and they had tried couples therapy to patch things together. And so when they decided to hire a live-in au pair in October of 2021 to help with childcare, it seemed like a practical solution for two working parents. The agency matched them with Juliana Peres Magalhães, a 21-year-old woman from Brazil who had come to the United States on a cultural exchange visa. Juliana moved into the Banfield home, and for nearly a year, the arrangement seemed to work. She helped care for the little girl. She got along with Christine, and she settled into the rhythms of suburban Virginia life. But by August of 2022, something had shifted. Brendan and Juliana had begun a sexual relationship, and what started behind Christine's back would, within 6 months, end with Christine's blood soaking into the bedroom carpet. And so this is where the story fractures into something much darker, because Brendan Banfield didn't just want to leave his wife. He wanted to keep everything. He wanted his daughter, he wanted his money, and he wanted Juliana. But a divorce would have given Christine the larger share of their assets and likely primary custody. Therefore, just 2 months into the affair, in October of 2022, Brendan told Juliana something that should have sent her running. He told her he had a plan to get rid of Christine, and Juliana didn't leave. She stayed and listened. Brendan's plan was unlike anything investigators had seen before. Rather than hiring someone or staging an accident, he decided to weaponize the internet. He sat down at Christine's own laptop and, using her Facebook photos, created a fake profile for his wife on FetLife, a website for people interested in sexual fetishes and BDSM. But he didn't just create a profile. He crafted an elaborate fantasy scenario, posing as Christine, writing that she wanted a stranger to come to her home and act out a simulated rape. The instructions were specific and horrifying. The stranger should arrive at the house late at night. The door would be unlocked. Christine would be asleep in bed. He should bring restraints and a knife. He should not stop, even if she screamed for help. And so Brendan Banfield, an IRS special agent trained in criminal investigation, spent an entire month messaging potential victims through this fake profile, carefully selecting someone who would walk into his home believing they had consent, someone who would become the perfect scapegoat for what Brendan was actually planning. He eventually connected with a 39-year-old man from Washington, D.C., named Joseph Ryan. But what makes this story so deeply disturbing is that Joseph Ryan was never an intruder. He wasn't a predator. He was a man who believed he had been invited. His own friends would later describe him as gentle, someone who was deeply concerned about consent in his relationships. His mother would eventually tell reporters through tears that her son wasn't just some creepy fetish guy. He was a person, and he had been deliberately lured to his death. In the weeks before February 24th, Brendan began preparing the house. He purchased triple-pane windows, which a window salesman would later testify was unusual, as most customers opt for double-pane. Prosecutors would argue this was to soundproof the home. He also bought a Glock 43X pistol and gave it to Juliana, and he surveilled his neighbors' homes, checking for doorbell cameras that might capture what was about to happen. But that wasn't even the most calculated part. Brendan also began changing his daily routine weeks in advance, stopping at a McDonald's drive-thru at odd hours, establishing a pattern so that on the night of the murders, his trip to McDonald's wouldn't seem suspicious. He needed to be away from the house when Joseph Ryan arrived, because his entire plan depended on one thing, making it look like a home invasion that he interrupted. And so, on the night of February 23rd, everything was set. Joseph Ryan had been told to arrive at the Banfield home in the early hours of February 24th. He brought restraints and a knife, exactly as the fake profile had instructed, because he believed Christine was expecting him. Brendan drove to McDonald's. Juliana waited in her car with the couple's 4-year-old daughter. When Ryan entered the unlocked home and went upstairs to the master bedroom, Juliana called Brendan. She was screaming that there was an intruder in the house, but this was the script. This was the alibi. Brendan raced home, and before going upstairs, he and Juliana placed his 4-year-old daughter in the basement with an iPad, and what happened next in that bedroom would haunt the investigators who pieced it together. Therefore, the prosecution's reconstruction of the next 90 seconds became the centerpiece of the trial. Brendan entered the bedroom and shouted, "Police Officer Christine," who had been asleep, woke to find a stranger in her room holding a knife. Her first instinct was to scream to her husband for help. "Brendan, he has a knife," she yelled, and that was the last thing she would ever say to him, because Brendan Banfield did not save his wife. He shot Joseph Ryan in the head. Then he turned to Christine, the woman he had been with for 19 years, the mother of his daughter, the nurse who spent her career protecting other people's children, and he climbed on top of her and stabbed her 7 times in the neck. Juliana was standing in the doorway holding the Glock. She testified that when she put her hands on the carpet, she felt blood, and she pulled them back. It had soaked through her shoes and socks. Then, according to prosecutors, Brendan instructed Juliana to shoot Ryan a second time, through the heart and spine, to implicate her in the killing and ensure her silence. And then he began staging. He smeared Christine's blood onto Ryan's body and hands, trying to make it look like Ryan had stabbed Christine before Brendan shot him in self-defense. And that was the story they told when Juliana called 911. A frantic au pair, a dead intruder, a heroic husband who arrived too late to save his wife. Downstairs, their 4-year-old daughter sat in the basement, alone, watching her iPad, with no idea what had just happened above her. But the crime scene told a different story. There were no signs of forced entry because Ryan had walked in through an unlocked door, exactly as he'd been instructed. The digital forensics told an even worse one. Investigators found that the FetLife profile had been created on Christine's laptop, but at the exact time the account was being set up, Christine's phone was being used for a WhatsApp conversation about her daughter. She couldn't have been on both devices simultaneously. Someone else had been using her computer. The telegram messages between the fake profile and Joseph Ryan contained phrasing that linguistic analysts identified as non-native English, matching Juliana's speech patterns. Brendan had traded in his phone shortly after the murders, destroying potential evidence. And perhaps the most chilling detail of all, when investigators returned to the Banfield home months later, they found that the master bedroom, the room where Christine had been stabbed to death, had been completely redecorated. New furniture, new flooring, and framed photographs of Brendan and Juliana displayed on the walls. It took 8 months, but in October of 2023, police arrested Juliana Peres Magalhães and charged her with second-degree murder. Facing decades in prison, she agreed to testify against Brendan in exchange for a plea to manslaughter. And when she took the stand in January of 2026, she described every detail of the plot, the fake profile, the alibi planning, the moment Brendan climbed onto his wife and drove the knife into her neck while she covered her eyes and ears. On February 2nd, 2026, After 9 hours of deliberation, a Fairfax County jury found Brendan Banfield guilty on all counts, 2 charges of aggravated murder, a firearms offense, and child endangerment. He showed no emotion as the verdict was read. He faces mandatory life in prison without the possibility of parole, with sentencing scheduled for May of 2026. Juliana Peres Magalhães was sentenced to 10 years, the maximum allowed under her plea agreement. The judge, Penny Escarate, called it the most serious manslaughter scenario her court had ever seen, but the person left to carry the weight of all of this is a little girl who is now 6 years old. The daughter Christine Banfield spent her career fighting for, the child she rushed home to after 12-hour ICU shifts, the 4-year-old who sat in a basement watching an iPad while her mother was murdered 1 floor above her. She will grow up without her mother, and her father will die in prison. Joseph Ryan's mother asked reporters to remember one thing. Her son was a real person, not a headline, not a plot device, not a cautionary tale about the internet. He was her child. And he walked into that house because someone he had never met told him he was welcome.